You might think that this video is about Americans and Asian call centers. It's not. This message is about cultural fluency. So if you're a digital nomad or an expat or thinking of moving to Asia, watch until the end, because this might be the most important video you ever see about succeeding in Asia.
She wasn't rude and she wasn't incompetent. She spoke English, real English, not broken English, and yet she still couldn't figure out why Americans kept asking to speak to an American supervisor. Rose works in IT Park, Cebu City, Philippines, and she pulled me aside one afternoon with what I can only describe as genuine frustration and confusion.
What am I doing wrong?
She said, and I thought, that is the most important question I've heard all week, because the answer to Rose's question, it's not about call centers. It's not even really about the Philippines. It's about a gap, an invisible gap that most Western men who relocate to Southeast Asia spend years stumbling over in relationships, in business, in friendships. Some of them never quite figure it out. But stick around, because I'm going to give you the key to the mystery. IT Park, Cebu City, Philippines. If you've ever called Chase Bank or an ISP or half a dozen other Fortune 500 companies, you've probably talked to somebody who works here. It's essentially a city inside a city, built on foreign money, staffed by some of the most English fluent workers in all of Southeast Asia. And that last part is important. When companies outsource to the Philippines, they're not scraping the bottom of the barrel. Filipino call center agents are chosen specifically for their strong English ability. They train for American accents. They study some American culture. They even watch American television when they're not watching Korean soap operas. So by the time Rose picks up your call, she's done the work, which is why her confusion was so sincere. Now, I've lived in 8 states, 4 countries, and I've spent time across 30 plus nations. And when you've moved around that much, you start to see patterns that people who stay in one place usually don't notice. One of the biggest patterns? Fluency in a language is not the same thing as fluency in a culture. And nowhere is that gap more visible, more compressed, more raw than in the call center industry. Here's what I told Rose. There are 2 Englishes. There's the English you learn, the grammar, vocabulary, syntax, the English that you can pass the test on. And then there's the English you absorb, the idioms, the metaphors, colloquialisms, the English that only makes sense if you grew up in the specific culture that invented it. Rose had mastered the first one. She had no grid for the second one. So I gave her an example, a simple one. I said, Rose, if I'm a customer and you've just offered me an upgrade, and I say, all right, let's execute the deal, what do you hear? She thought about it for a moment. She said,
I think you are not interested. Why you want to end the conversation?
Execute, she heard as terminate, as in kill it, stop it, walk away. In the American English context, execute means finalize. You're a yes, you want the upgrade, you're ready to move forward, but Rose would have politely moved on. The customer would have gone from slightly interested to genuinely confused. The upgrade or the upsell would have died right there, and neither of them would have known just exactly what happened. That is not a language problem. That is a cultural encoding issue. And it's not just execute the deal. Americans speak in idioms constantly, and we don't even notice it. It's like a second operating system running in the background of every conversation. Think about how many phrases we throw around every day that hardly make any literal sense. Let's circle back on that. We need to move the goalposts. I'm going to push back on that. That's a ballpark figure. Let's not drop the ball on this one. If you grew up in America, you process all of those instantly. You don't even register them as metaphors. They're just words, and we know what they mean. Conversely, if you grew up in the Philippines, You're doing real-time translation under pressure with a customer that's likely already frustrated and on a call that's being monitored. Here's the thing. The Filipino agent doesn't want to admit they didn't understand. That would be embarrassing and considered disrespectful. In Filipino culture, Pakisama, meaning harmony, keeping the peace, runs deep. You don't create friction. You don't say, I don't know or I don't understand you. You say, certainly, sir, and you move on. So the misunderstanding gets buried. And the American customer, who never knew there was a misunderstanding, they just wonder why the problem didn't get resolved. Now multiply that by every call, every day, every week. Are you starting to see the magnitude of the problem here? And I want to be clear, this isn't stupidity, it isn't laziness, it isn't lack of effort on their part. Listen, roughly 30% of Filipinos have enough English fluency for moderate communication. But there is a significant gap between moderate communication and cultural fluency. And that gap, that specific gap, that is the thing nobody is talking about. Now let's talk about the second gap because idioms are just the surface. The deeper issue is how each culture thinks about rules. When an American customer makes what they consider to be a reasonable request, something outside the standard script, and the Filipino agent says, I'm sorry, sir, that's against our policy, the Filipino believes they've done their job. They've been polite, they've been professional, they have delivered the answer. From their perspective, the call is essentially over. The American customer, they heard something completely different. They heard, I am a screen. I cannot help you, and I am not going to try. Here's the cultural divide in a single sentence. In Filipino culture, a policy is a wall. It's a hard stop. In American culture, a policy is a suggestion written by a manager who isn't even on the call. Americans, and especially Americans dealing with corporations, have been trained through years of frustration to understand that policies, they're not laws. They were written by people. They can be overridden by the right person. And the right person, a supervisor, a manager, someone with actual authority, they can make an exception. That's not unreasonable. That's just how Americans learn to navigate corporate bureaucracy. And look, it's worth saying this too. Americans can be callous, and they're certainly not always right. But years of being passed around, put on hold, read scripts to, it makes people sharp-edged. It makes them transactional. They stop seeing the human being on the other end of the line because the system has sort of conditioned them not to see that person anymore. That's a different problem. But the request for an American supervisor, it's almost never personal. It's almost never, I don't want to talk to you because of where you're from. It's almost always, I need someone who has the cultural fluency and the organizational authority to actually solve my problem. Rose may have heard racism, but what was actually being communicated was desperation. Now, here's why I'm telling you all this. This isn't a video about call centers. If you're a Western man who's thinking about relocating to Southeast Asia, or if you're already here and something in your daily life just feels off, like there's a friction you can't quite name, this is it. This gap right here. The idiom gap and the policy gap are not exclusive to call centers. They're the compressed, high-stakes version of something you will encounter everywhere. In your apartment lease negotiation, when your landlord smiles and says, yes, but he means something closer to, I'll try. In your relationship, when your partner doesn't tell you something is wrong because the conflict would be shameful, the loss of face, and the problem festers until it explodes. In your business, when a local partner agrees to a timeline that was never realistic in their standard, but saying no to your face would feel worse than missing the deadline. These are not character flaws. These are all features of a high context culture colliding with a low context one. Let me break it down for you quickly. Low context cultures like America say what they mean. Communication is direct, explicit. If I'm unhappy, I tell you. If I disagree, I say so. The words carry the message. High context cultures like the Philippines carry the message in everything around the words: tone, relationship history, body language, social hierarchy. What is not said is often more important than what is said. When a low context person walks into a high context culture and doesn't know this, they get blindsided constantly. They feel like people are being evasive or dishonest or even passive aggressive. They're not. They're communicating in a language you don't speak yet. And this is where most expats actually fail. Not because they're bad people, not because the culture is wrong, but because nobody helped them in this map. After I explained all of this to Rose, the idiom gap, the policy wall, the low context, high context divide, I watched something change in her face. The distress didn't completely disappear, but it shifted. It became something smaller, manageable. She said,
是为医生而到迷。
No, Rose, it isn't about you. It's about two entirely different operating systems trying to run the same software. And here's the practical takeaway I want you to walk away with from this video. Understanding precedes empathy. And empathy is the only tool that actually closes these gaps. Not just tolerance. Tolerance is more like suppressed frustration wearing a polite mask. Actual understanding. Understanding that when a Filipino colleague smiles and says, no problem, they might mean, I generally cannot do this, but I'm too polite to say so directly. Understanding that when an American customer pushes back, they're not attacking the person, they're attacking the system. Understanding that the reason your expat relationship feels like a guessing game sometimes isn't because your partner is withholding. It's because they were raised in a culture that considers directness impolite. These are learnable distinctions, and the man who learns them, who actually learns them, not just intellectually, but practically, has a huge advantage over every other Westerner who lands in Southeast Asia thinking that English and good intentions are enough. They're not enough. They're the price of entry. The actual game starts here. Rose got back to work, and I went back to my coffee. I thought, this is why I'm here. Not to hand people a suitcase and a flight ticket and say, Asia's better, go live your life. But to hand them a map, because the relocation itself is the easy part. You book a flight, you find an apartment, done. The hard part is learning to see. I mean, really see the culture that you've walked into, to understand why things work the way they do, to stop interpreting foreign behavior through the lens of where you grew up. And if you're watching this channel, I think you already know the easy answers aren't the ones you came here for. If this sort of makes sense to you now, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're at in this cultural gap type stuff. Have you been burned by it? I want to hear your story too. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that because we're just getting started around here.